This Convergence Science Network event at Story Hall, RMIT University. I'm Luan Ismail, the network founder and convener, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here on a wet Melbourne evening. I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to welcome our audience joining us online this evening. Welcome. Thank you for your interest in this evening's discussion, and welcome from wherever you may be joining us. Our discussion today was inspired by last year's Graham Clark oration, which some of you may have attended, delivered by Dr. Natalia Trayanova from Johns Hopkins University, who inspired us with how the use of digital twins was being used by her and her research team to predict the risk of heart attacks. While the concept of digital twins may be new, it's a buzzword at the moment, it's actually been around for quite a while. Digital twins meaning a term for the simulation of objects. So this evening we're privileged to have 4 speakers who will share some exciting examples of the application of digital twins to the biomedical industry, a sector of particular strength here in Melbourne and across Australia. Time will be available at the conclusion of the presentations for your questions, and for those of you attending online, please use the chat function to put your question. So let's get right into it. I'd like to invite the first speaker, Professor David Fletcher, Adjunct Professor at the University of Sydney. He will be followed by Professor Kiao Inthavong of RMIT University, Stuart Knowles of Invetech, and Vashishta, beg your pardon, of Leica Biosystems. Please give a warm welcome to Professor David Fletcher. David?
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and especially those online who are braving the internet to be with us. What I'd like to do over the next 40 minutes is really introduce you to the ideas of digital twins and what goes into building them. And we're going to take lots and lots of examples from biomedical. So let's just make sure this is working. Nope. Yes. Yep, I've got to point that way. Okay, just a little bit about myself. I've been doing simulation for now 40 years. And I started my training was really in the nuclear industry. And that's significant because there's a few industries where quality matters: aerospace, nuclear, medicine. And if you've been in those areas, you really think hard about quality. You know, lots of people died from the Chernobyl accident because of poor quality control in understanding the reactor design. I've been working with the LEAP team here for 20 plus years, doing simulation and supporting simulation. And I'm an adjunct professor at Sydney Uni in chemical engineering, where I have students, research projects, my own projects. So I'm actually very hands-on with software. And I think that's important. If you're going to be using this stuff, you need hands-on experience because you'll then realize the pros and cons of what you can do with software. And recently, I've joined as an academic lead for ASPAC in the Avicina Alliance, and their specific objective is connecting with regulators and helping make simulation more palatable to regulators by showing how it can be used to reduce development times, etc. And that's some of the things I want to talk about tonight. So here's just a few examples of the types of simulation you might see. So when we talk about the medical industry, we've got to think about top left there. We've got tablet coding and tablet manufacture. We've got treatment of a cancer in a leg, where we're using electromagnetic waves here, and so we need to be able to model things like that. A drug being delivered to an eye and how it spreads, but that could be anywhere. A chromatography device being modeled to look at separation of chemicals, and then from that know what compounds are in them. And then deployment of a stent. I think this is one of the areas where everybody knows somebody who's had a stent put in, and how amazing that technology is. A small cut in a arterial or vein, slide a stent in, open it up, and re-establish the blood flow. Oops, I'll get the hang of this. So, what are we going to cover today? We are going to cover exactly why does healthcare need to innovate, and how is it going to do that, introduce digital twins, and what are some of the examples of how you construct models to go into digital twins. So this example on the left-hand side may seem a little strange. Those are bioreactors. But if you think about it, most drugs have to be manufactured at large scale. Vitamin supplements, etc., need to be manufactured at large scale. And what you find is industry is very conservative, so they typically use mixing tanks and that. But this was a project where we looked at, okay, there's a much cheaper technology maybe in bubble columns that could help with manufacture. And so there's a very wide spectrum of simulation that goes into the healthcare and the biomedical industry. What do we need to do? Why do we need some of this change of innovation? Well, if you look at the amount of money in healthcare, it's just rising, dramatically. Procedures are getting more and more expensive. Equipment is becoming more expensive because you're able to get much more detailed scans. You can treat diseases and things that you couldn't treat a while back. So it's a very expensive industry. Everything that's used in a medical industry has to be approved. And that approval can be very much sped up if you can use simulation. If you look in external industry, simulation is a core part of anything you do. It needs to progress much deeper and faster into the biomedical scene. And that will bring us back to some ideas around the quality. So here's an example of the cost of drugs to market. Because everything's becoming more expensive, the number of drugs that you can get approved is going down per dollar or per $1 million because of the very strict requirements. And whilst high requirements are essential, let's see if some of these things can be done more efficiently, cheaper. And running simulations can cost 1/10 of what it costs to do an experiment. So this is really interesting because on one side you've got one-size-fits-all medicine. On Wednesday last week, my wife had a hip replacement. The surgeon was also a professor at Sydney Uni, so I ended up chatting to him before the operation. They now make a 4D model, literally, of it, so the 3D scan, and then they look at multiple positions. They do finite element on the implant and the whole system to choose the best possible implant to put in. So that's not a digital twin. That's a one step of simulation. If it were a digital twin, there would be some instrument in that joint which would feed back information to the model. And we'll look at that distinction a bit later. But if we look at what is going on in medicine, so in vitro is basically doing experiments. In vivo is either using rats, mice, rabbits, or human trials to get something approved. In silico literally means doing it on a computer in silicon. And you can see that stuff has started, and that area is going to grow. Internet of Things, or Internet of Medical Things, is a consequence of like the Industry 4.0, the Medicine 4.0 initiative, where you start to become much smarter, much more connected. So by connected, that means that when you put an implant in, some data are going to go back to a model. So connectivity, two-way data exchange. And then with that, you can make a digital twin. Everywhere is looking to reduce the dependence on animal testing. There's all sorts of reasons for that, humane, cost, and then also, with that, also reducing person trials. If you can, you want things to be as close to working when the first person has that implanted or whatever. So the more you can do in silico, the more things you can find out about a system. So if you look at the whole medical industry, starting with pharmaceuticals, devices, clinical, and then ultimately digital twins, simulation and modeling is a large part of that. So if you go to drug discovery, there's a whole set of simulation, computational biology, which I've not included in that, where you can discover molecules. But once you've got a molecule you think's active, then there's a whole set of simulation around the manufacture, the packaging, the delivery device, what sort of inhaler you use to get a respirable drug into the lungs. And it's really, really important that these things are modeled and tested. You could only get COVID vaccinations so quickly and produced at large scale if people understood the process. So it was one thing that was good was actually getting the drug, the molecules that could do it, but another was making so much so quickly. And if you can optimize your manufacturing processes, you can obviously improve the quality, the speed of turnover, get the costs down. Products, you think of any medical product, breathing equipment, an earpiece to give you hearing, any sort of joint, then those are going to need very specific simulation to assist with their design and testing and making sure that they're fit for purpose. And then once you've done that, if you can use simulation to also show how they're going to perform, and also by doing lots of simulation, when something goes wrong, you will have hopefully seen that failure mode, especially if you've got a digital twin, you might be able to predict it in advance. Computer-aided diagnosis, that's just absolutely massive. So there's so many scans taken now. You can then do imaging from those, reconstructions, then include models in them, like structural, like flow, like electromagnetic, and really give computer-aided guidance to surgery. And then finally, there's the idea of when you deploy something, deploying it with a digital twin. So we'll talk a little more about that, but the essence of a digital twin is we must be having two-way communication so that we can monitor what the condition of that piece of equipment is or that implant, confront that with a model. If we see something going out of range, then the model needs to be looking to understand what could be causing that. Is it a material problem? Is it a crack? Is it a failure in some connecting rod in this system or whatever? And trying to isolate that in the digital twin. So anybody who flies in a plane will be looked after by a digital twin of the engines. So engines have digital twins. They're constantly got massive amounts of data being taken, confronting reduced order models that cover how an engine works. And if they go outside of certain limits, those models are starting to look, what's the problem? Could it be a blade failure? Could it be a hole in the side, etc.? And being able to understand what the scenarios might be, so you're much less blind when something changes. And that's the same with a medical digital twin. You don't want to be blind of what's going on until something catastrophic happens. So a couple of interesting examples I found. So a catheter is basically a tube for transporting a fluid, but now you can need multiple pathways into the body. So you've got multiple tubes within a single tube, outer tube. And of course, this is something where you really do need to do simulation, because you can calculate the flow, get the pressure drop, the flow field. You can do structural and get the bending stresses, the fatigue, move it and see whether it's going to have a natural frequency. You can optimize for those things. So you can optimize the layout in there to reduce pressure drop. Nobody wants to have to pump harder than they need, but you might be willing to pay for more pumping costs by having a stiffer structure that wasn't going to deform and block the tube. And of course, once you know what you want, making it is another matter. You've got to design a die so that you can extrude it. So all of that has got a big role for simulation. I found this one online, which I think is really fascinating. If you want to construct a damage to a spine, and what people can do with spinal reconstruction now is becoming phenomenal. But there's lots of questions and things you have to look at. So you might start with some geometry that you decide based on specific data from the patient. You've got to find materials to put there. So having material properties and material libraries is so essential to that. Then you might want to do the biomedical loading. So you could use a very simple connection there and determine what stresses it has to carry. Then you could do some topology optimization. Then you could say, okay, this is the topology I need, but let's make it a lattice so it's strong but doesn't have excessive weight and material. Now you've got to pass some standards, and F2077 is a compression testing standard that you have to pass, so you can do that in simulation. And then you can go and look at the manufacturing that and what thermal stresses might do to it. And you've done all this simulation to make sure that the part you're going to insert has passed all sorts of tests and is as optimal as you can make it. So, you know, that's another part of simulation, is doing optimization. Trying to make it as good as you can. Obviously with a spine there, you can't just have a stack of spine parts and pick one off the shelf and put in. These need to be customized. So every part of the healthcare process can benefit from digital modeling. So, you know, drug manufacturing we've already talked about. Drug delivery equipment, whether it be inhalers, whether it be pumps, whether it be sprays to the nose. Implantable devices, so whether you implant a heart valve or some sort of orthopedic implant. And then also, there's a ton of equipment in hospitals that needs to be modeled and monitored. And so, you know, it's down through a whole load of different applications, from pharma to medical technology to in vitro testing. Using simulation to design the best in vitro tests that you can, and understanding what their limitations and strengths are. Excuse me. I was involved with some work recently where there was a section of the gut with peristaltic flow, and somebody was making an apparatus to do that, and we could simulate that with fluid structure interaction and tell them a lot more about it, and we could tell them whether the material they were going to use would survive repeated use or not. So there's a big synergy. Just because somebody's doing experimental work doesn't mean they won't benefit from simulation. And then there's getting towards the regulatory. So the US and Europe are moving very fast to have simulation evidence recognized for regulation. Excuse me, it's hot in here. That's something that Australia is starting to talk about, and is people from Australia, from the TGA, are going out to these meetings, and it's going to happen here too. And so those of us doing simulation need to be in a position to provide the guidance and leadership that's needed there. And that's one of our things. I think the senior simulation people have got a huge obligation to bring on a generation of good simulation people to be able to take this task on. So if we start with the process here, so if we start at 6 p.m., we want to start some simulations. We have to manage the simulation of the data. We might then need to reduce that to a simple reduced order model, because some of the simulations might take days to run. Obviously, that's no use for making quick decisions, but you can capture that data in a reduced order model. You want to be able to employ those to help with regulatory compliance. You've got to make sure that the materials have been checked and are compliant. You can have your digital system prototyping there, so all the control and that goes with it, and all of that might then feed into a digital twin. And you can see in this that there's lots to be done. So material data, a corporate level, a company that's doing biomedical equipment have to invest a lot in materials and material compatibility. That's knowledge that they need to store and build, and have the right knowledge to be able to use stuff in simulation. So know about the materials they're using. Without that, they can't do digital models. So you might have like here in the bottom right, that might be a physical twin and a digital twin, so it might be some sort of reactor. It might be a computer model of that, and they're talking to each other. We definitely have to be able to go from very detailed simulations of structures, fluids, electromagnetics, to much simpler models that can be built into like digital twins. You can't have a digital twin that runs a fluid structure interaction every time it wants to ask a question or answer a question, because it's just too costly. And then there's all this whole question of verification and validation. If we don't have verified, validated models, no regulatory organization is going to want to touch them, and nobody working in this area wants to be making decisions about somebody's health without having a proper, validated, verified model, and in all conscious believing they've done the very best to advise. So this is from an article that I was an author of in Nature Communication about digital twins in cardiovascular. There's a key point in all this, that what we must do if we're going to have a true digital twin is we gather information, and that information might be sent to a data store via the internet, Bluetooth, doesn't matter, it gets there. Then you use those data. So you might use those data to build a digital twin, and you start to see if they're behaving similarly, and then you can use machine learning, etc., to make this stuff much faster. And you can send outputs from that to the doctor, to the cloud, so it's more widely available. But what must be happening for it to be a true digital twin is it must be going back and constantly accessing data from the patient and reconciling that. So it's not a one-way process where you build a model, you validate it, and it stops. A digital twin has to be two-way coupled. Data is coming from the patient or the device in the patient, and that information is going into the digital twin. The twin is updating itself, and it's growing its knowledge from what's fed back, and it's also at the same time trying to confront, is this a normal situation or is something potentially going wrong? And that's the other role of a digital twin, to know when something's no longer normal. So if we look at some good examples of digital twins that are out there, a simple reactor here, if we're using that for preparing some sort of bio compound, then there's going to be a lot of processes going on in there. You're going to have oxygen transfer. You're going to have maybe bacteria in there or enzymes. So you've got to transfer enough oxygen. You've got to get the pH right. You've got to make sure that the shear in there is below certain values, or you'll destroy your cells that are in there. The cells won't grow. You've got to assume that you want the nutrient to be properly dispersed. And you want the whole thing to have a uniform temperature, say. And so you can have models which are looking at this and feeding back. And if you get data from there which is out of range, then you have to start worrying about what's gone wrong with the system. So, and this way you can improve performance. So you don't have to improve the conditions in these by much to suddenly get, a 5% yield improvement, say, and that's massive dollars, massive product enhancement. So having a properly controlled model system here can actually be hugely beneficial for productivity and the stability of the system. So this is a project that's going on at ANSYS in Lyon, in France, which is mind-blowing. They are making a Python-based heart model where they want to include all the physics. So there's some green areas where there's good progress. There's some yellow areas where there's work still going on to do. But they want to have the flow, the mechanical behavior, the electrical behavior, a pacemaker there, and be able to model all of this stuff. They now have a strategy for taking scan data and getting it to a geometry in about 20 minutes with very good techniques to clean scan data and extract geometry. So you can imagine that this type of tool is going to just get better and better with time and computing resources. This is work from Oklahoma State University on entry into the lungs. So looking at, they've got computational particle dynamics, so small particles that you want to get to the lungs. You've got the motion of the lungs there. Now, you cannot model in any sort of simulation all the way down to the alveolar, because the number of kilometers, if you like, of tubing is going to be crazy if you do that. So you might use detailed simulations, say down to generation 13, and then simple network models beyond that, and have a system that you can really make as quantitative. So, you know, this is towards having a digital twin based on scans. You can obviously do scans of all the throat and the nasal there, and with appropriate models. And then this twin site is a company, I think they started in France, and they have offices in France and Germany. France and the US now. And they're basically doing, 3D modeling of joints and being able to test those and have a digital twin for this. So based on the person's weight, the loads, the way they walk, all of that can be fed into these type of models to see what the loads are on the joint, on the muscles. So, this is the slide to hurt you all, to punish you for not being mathematicians like me. But there's a serious point to it. So, digital twins are based on well-known physics. And so it's really important to understand, whether it be fluids, structures, particle motion, there are fundamental equations that are solved, which are laws that not, you can't meddle with them. They are the law for doing that. And so you can, provided you solve them properly and you put in the right constitutive laws, you can actually be sure you're going to get out the right answer. So obviously, if we take finite element analysis, if I put in the wrong material properties, I get the wrong answer. But the equations that I'm putting into are actually correct. So you kind of shift the burden to not having to prove the fundamental laws, but having to use them correctly. And then there's one odd one out here, because I want you to be able to distinguish between, some people do modeling with a process called smooth particle hydrodynamics, where you treat a fluid like a collection of particles, and it can be a very efficient method. But what you've got to understand is that's not a fundamental law, that's an approximation. And so it's really, really important when you're in modeling to understand what is true, what is an assumption, what is a constitutive law that has to be used to close a model. So I was recently asked to write a review for the chemical process industry for its centennial there. And they asked me to specifically say, what's the future of simulation in computational fluid dynamics in this industry? And I wanted to do some key points here. So fewer and fewer people understand the equations and the physics, but they still do simulation. So it's really important when we're in medical particularly that we understand the equations and the physics. It's important that we understand what constitutive models we're using. So whether that be a turbulence model in fluids, or how the fluid behaves when it has random flow in a turbulent, what the material properties are. You've really got to understand what you're putting in and have a strong rationale and evidence for those. If you're going to use software, you've got to be properly trained. You need to understand the basics. You also need to know how to use the tools. And when you've got a model, it's not good enough to just say, I've got pictures. You've got to validate and verify. So verify is to check maybe against analytic solutions, against common sense. Validation is to compare with experiment. And we have to keep in mind experiments aren't perfect either. When I see a simulation that goes through every dot of experimental data, I know it's made up, okay? Because you're never able to do that. It's really important that you keep these things in mind. And I'm going to tell you that there were too few PhD-trained computational engineers out there. And that's just a fact. If you talk to people in industry and that, there are not enough people. There are loads of people who've done some simulation, but they're not computational engineers. They don't understand what their simulation is doing. And now we need to understand this as we go towards AI and machine learning. What are we going to cover up with that? So this shortage needs to be there, and those engineers also need how to interface with AI and machine learning. It's really important, I think, this point about what we need from our universities. I'm now going to give a few examples. So this is some work done with the CSIRO here in Melbourne, and it's about stomach modelling. So I do need to just get a couple of these movies going. Now I don't know whether I dare click. But let me talk about, maybe we'll just see this one. So this was a theoretical-like experiment where you put some oil in the stomach, you put some water on top, and you looked at how density inversion occurs in the stomach, and understanding how that interacts with the shape. Why do we care about these things? We care about it because of obesity and stomach problems. How is food in there and digested? But also, what happens when you put medications in the stomach? So this was like a bit of a starting job to look at that flow. And because you can do this process with a number of different techniques, it's a great validation, because you can compare techniques. Now, I'm going to skip over those because this is... Come on. I don't want to see them all. Yeah, so this is let me go back one. This was, let me just go back and then forward again. So started off with layers of coloured particles and look at how they mix in the stomach when you've got the contraction waves. And then look at how acid moves into the stomach and how important. Now the question is, how important is that contraction wave? So let's go and have a look. Let's do a simulation with a static wall and with a moving wall. So that's the other thing about simulations. You can do what ifs. So if somebody's got a set of contraction waves that are abnormal, you can set up a simulation and start looking, how is their stomach functioning? How is the mixing going? How is the acid being introduced? So these are your steps that you need to build a digital twin. I've got a couple of slides on inhalation devices. This has come from a recent review that we wrote on a strategy for designing devices. So if you want to get a device to market here, you've got to get approval. And so there's certain things that you'd like to be able to do. You'd like to be able to say how the device works. You'd like to be able to show how it works by doing some standard pharmaceutical tests. But if you're going to rely on the simulation, you'd also like to have it validated as much as you can. Now, but often your validation cannot be directly like inside a device. So if you think of that lower, like a test tube, that's inside an inhaler, which has got a couple of swirlers on it. Now, when you can't actually measure the flow in there with a laser sheet, but you can measure what comes out. So by combining these techniques, you can actually start to make sure that you're using the correct models. So on these plots here, the dotted plots are measured velocity components and fluctuations, and then the coloured bars are different models, how you treat the turbulence in there. And what you can see shows up very clearly is it's the red line that fits, and some of the others are a pretty bad fit to the real data. And that allows you to choose which model you're going to use moving forward. So the good quality experiment and simulation are hand in hand. Anybody who tells you experiment is redundant is completely wrong. You need high quality experiment to validate simulation, and then simulation can tell you what's going on inside. And it's not a bad assumption that if you could predict the way the jet behaves outside, you've likely got it right inside. So that's kind of important. A couple of bits of simulation with my colleague Kiao, who we work together. This is just to say what you can do now in terms of looking at things like spray breakup, looking at the complex flow in the throat, and understanding where the flow is smooth, where it's turbulent, and that is highly possible. You can do very high-level simulations that can help you understand the components of anything you're making. So if you're making a spray, you can understand how it's going to break up into certain droplets and what the shape of the chamber is going to do to that. Let's just check for time. How am I going? 6:39, that's good. So high quality simulation again is really important here, and that is information that can start to be used to form a digital twin. So our last major topic is around hearts, and this is a project I'm super passionate about. It's about developing a polymeric heart valve replacement for children. And the key thing here is if a child is born with a heart defect, they may have to have 5 valve replacements between being aged 3 to 23. Can you imagine your child having 5 lots of surgery, maybe 3 of that open heart, and every time, of course, there's a risk they'll die? Why do they need that? Because their arteries and that are growing, and the valve has to be replaced because it doesn't grow with them. And of course, if the valve stops functioning, there's no oxygen, and that's catastrophic. So I'm working on a project where we've got a pretty strong team that we've put together here. And I want to talk to you about some of the simulation work that's going into that. So it's a very young team. The average age here is pretty low. Key in this is the second person, Professor David Winlaw, who was the surgeon with the passion to do this. And he came and sought out a couple of us, my colleague Fariba, because she was into biomaterials, and then very quickly they realized that simulation was going to be key, and that's how I got into it. So we've built up this team. COVID hit just as we started all this project, so we kept the team together through COVID. And one of the things I did was democratize simulation. So get the experimentalists involved with simulation, even though they weren't going to do it, but to see what we could do. And so the simulation team worked super hard and involved lots of people in simulations, so that when they went back to doing their work, they understood the sort of needs we've got. Luke from Leap, a colleague from here, has been instrumental in working with us on this. Give him a plug. So, when you're getting into a project like this, you've got an end goal. You want a really detailed model of this valve. You want all the materials problems sorted. You want all the surface coating problems sorted and everything. But you can't have that. You've got to go step by step. So our first step was to take scans of, I think this was a pig's valve, extract from it some of the essential geometry and fit a mathematical equation to it, build a valve, do FEA. So take a typical pressure load on it. Can we open these properly? And can they snap through or not with the sorts of materials we want to use? So that was the very first step. So Why do you do simple things first? Because you can throw out certain designs very quickly. Yeah? It's like if you were designing some piece of equipment. Get rid of the bad ideas very quickly, then only bring more sophisticated ideas onto good candidates. So next step was to start putting fluids in this. We've got a pulse duplicator, which allows us to measure the flow through and record it. And you can see you start to get, there's this effective orifice area when it's open. And those look quite different between the simulation and the measured, but actually it's the scale, like there's 122 to 132. It's pretty damn close. And so you start to be able to understand whether it's going to be fit for purpose. That second picture at the bottom there shows you what the polymeric valve is that's going into here. So there's a lot of materials that have gone into this, materials understanding, but you know, we get to the point where a certain valve here can be opened, and then we can start looking at how well it opens. So this was done by a process. So when you've got data from a pulse duplicator, you get both pressure and mass flow, so you can use one of them to match the other. So you can take the pressure, the blue, fit a dotted line through that part of the curve, and calculate the red goes with the full brown line, and this was just during the open phase, and start matching up the data and understanding what's going on. Then you can go to a full coupled two-way flow and include a viscous solver, which means you capture the viscosity, the turbulence even, and couple it. And now you're looking into the valve, and that's what it's like when it comes together to close. You'd be surprised your valves don't close perfectly, and they come in on each other. There's always a bit of reflux. There's about 5%. And then you can start looking at the flow. So the peak flowing through there is about 6 meters a second. And you can see the process whereby as it closes, it shuts it off. And you can see how much the tube is deforming outside of this. So very quickly, you'll realize that a valve is not a valve on its own. It has to be fitted into something. That brings you to this piece of work, where essentially we took lots of scans of children's, the ducts that you want to put the valve in. Often the valve sits next to the heart, but you can't replace it there directly. You want to put a valved conduit in. So on the left of each of those pictures is a scanned conduit, and on the right is basically done a bit of optimization to remove kinks in that, to start to think about where would you put the valve in this. Because again, you can't just test a valve in a perfect pulse duplicator with a straight tube when it's going to have to go into this tight duct, because you might start getting flow separations that you're not aware of. So you've got to be able to move forward and use your models in these complex situations. And none of this is even close to making a digital twin here yet. But from the design process, you can see that this digital input is absolutely essential to understanding. If you just have experimental data, you have an outcome from an experiment, but it's very hard to answer the why. Why did that happen? So one final project, and this is a project that is being led by a colleague, Stuart Grieve, and Gemma Figtree at Sydney Uni. It's called the BioHeart. And so you can see here, this is some conventional simulations looking at aneurysms and that. But what is special about this project is that they've got a lot of 4D flow data. So that means 3D space, time, they've got fluid measurements. But what they're also doing now for the same patients, they're quantifying all the biomarkers and that against them. So there's a genomics component, so that later on when you start analysing this, you can start relating the different disease states, if you like, to genomic sequences and that. So it's a much more integrated thing. that's happening. There are some amazing projects like this going on worldwide. I mean, in this case, there's more than 1,000 scans available. So, that brings me, I hope, a good timing towards the end. So, simulations will have to become more prevalent. They've had to become more prevalent in industry to keep it competitive. They'll have to become more used here to design processes, to design equipment, you know, whether this be a CPAP machine to help you with breathing, or a process to make a drug, or a implant. You've got to have simulation. With simulation, immediately comes the option to do some automation. So you can do by eye optimization, you know, if I tweak this corner, it'll be a bit better. But now you can do a lot of automated. You can have automated geometry updates where you use things called adjoints to move the geometry for you and see what will give you the lowest pressure drop and the smoothest flow. Then you'll start to develop digital twins where you bring patient measurements and simulation results together. And typically, simulations, long running, you make yourself a simpler, reduced order model with AI. You've got data coming from the person. They're confronting each other and understanding whether things are working normally or whether we've gone off the normal spectrum, in which case what might be happening. So to build a digital twin, you need to approach it in a step-by-step manner. So my advice and thing is always tackle the most important physics first. Like if your valve won't open properly, then throw it away because it's not going to be any use to you. Oops, sorry, I'm stealing that. This is horrible, this thing. Will you wait? I hope you do it too so that I don't look bad. So take that, eliminate your bad designs, then start to bring forward advanced and coupled physics. So make it better, bring in optimization, and that's really important. And then get to a digital twin. So, and ask yourself, if somebody says, I've got a digital twin of something, now you know what questions to ask. Is it really a two-way interaction between data? Because if it is, it's a digital twin. If it's like, I made these measurements and I created a model, that is not a digital twin, okay? That's just a validated model. And I think if I've judged it, my time should be up pretty closely. Yeah. So thanks everybody for your attention, and I hope that's been fascinating for you. I'm going to put up the title slide for Kiao.
I'm going to practice. How do I go back? Oops. Okay, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all the guests out there online. Thanks for making it to this presentation. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work that my group have been working on for the past few years. We've got this title here, CFD AI-assisted respiratory reduced order models, which is quite long. So as good engineers, we will shorten that to CARM. And so the purpose of this is to provide a new diagnostic tool for point-of-care applications or diagnosis. So I'll just talk about my team quickly and my role. So I'm an associate professor at RMIT University. We've got a team of about 9 at the moment, a few academics and some postgraduates and also some honours students. We started working with multi-phase flows and its applications both in industry and then moving into biomedical. And the first project we really looked into or delving into biomedical was the inhalation project, which is really looking at inhalation exposure, dealing with looking at how particles are inhaled, which is quite relevant in the recent COVID pandemic. And our newest project that we're moving to is this Caram flow, which we want to be able to look at or apply what we've established and integrate that with the latest technologies. So this is an example of the particle flowing through our nasal cavity. So if you've never seen inside your nose before, this is what it looks like. It's quite complicated. All those curves are your sinuses, your paranasal sinuses, and a lot of the times these are the points or regions that cause a lot of pain amongst patients. So if you know people who have suffered chronic or nasal obstruction, it's quite debilitating. Breathing is dysfunctional, and you get a lot of problems related to that. So when a patient presents to clinic, they firstly do subjective tests, which are like a survey, and they ask you, how do you feel? How's your congestion? Where's the pain? And you give them a scale of 1 to 5. They can do also some objective tests, which are involved with, or which involves rhinometry. So they send some signal waves down your nose, and they can determine where the blockage is, and they bounce back the sound waves. And then they can also do CT scans or medical imaging. From that information, the ENT specialist, the ear, nose, throat doctor, gives you a diagnosis. And they have two options. They give you medical therapy, which is probably the most preferred option for most people. So that's nasal sprays or a nasal irrigation. In severe cases, they may say, hey, you've probably got to go for surgery. And if you think about how sensitive our noses are, and think about these machines going to your nose and cutting out some bone, it's quite yucky, right? So this is not the preferred option, but unfortunately, if the cases can't be resolved, this is what happens. And after surgery, they need to get post-treatment, and typically post-treatment will involve some kind of nasal irrigation to flush out all the mucus or the blood remains that are in there. Hopefully, that solves your problem. However, many cases, patients go back for a second round of surgery when both medical therapy and surgery fails. And this is what we want to avoid. And so what's the causes of these? If I take these words from my colleagues who are surgeons, a surgeon's interpretation of those tests, the objective, subjective tests and CT scans, are typically their opinion. It's a subjective opinion. There's variability amongst each surgeon. And there's no real way to scientifically and robustly give them a diagnosis. So what if we can include some simulation data and bump it in there before they make their diagnosis and provide them with some informed decisions? Okay, if we can do that, then this section here is where our study will move into, this Caram flow. Our simulation data will move in, allowing the surgeons to have an informed choice and then provide much better surgery planning and also medical treatment, and hopefully mitigate the second round of surgery. And so what are the main data points or information that we can gather that we require to establish this Caram flow? From the CT scanning or the radio imaging scan, medical imaging, we can get geometry markers. So we can determine or we can identify certain shapes and certain locations, cross-sectional areas, perimeters of the nasal airway. And we combine that with demographics of the patient, and also the objective test results and subjective test results. We then include some computational fluid dynamics flow simulations that gives us the detailed data that we need. That gives us the pressure drop that we want, or we can identify where the largest obstruction area is, and then we can actually inform the surgeons, hey, let's do the surgery in this part or in this region. Oh, the text is a bit funny, but okay, so what are some of these typical demographic markers? So there is this theory that depending where you are or you're located geographically, our noses have evolved over time to adapt to climatic changes. So here are some different shapes or different morphologies. We've got one where there's no notch. So at the front, you've actually got a straight curve. In the middle, we've got a bilateral where you've got a notch, like a little indentation on both sides. And a unilateral, you've got one on one side of the nasal cavity. We can create, we extract all this data from our CT scans and our 3D CAD model that we produce. We've got these markers called the circularity. If we take cross-sectional shape across the nasal cavity, we can determine where it becomes more spherical or less spherical. And we can also find out where the cross-sectional area starts to minimize or starts to increase. Some flow characteristics that we can find include the temperature contours, the surface heat flux, and the temperature distribution. So at some point in your nasal cavity, let me go back. The nasal cavity is an unbelievable heat exchanger. By the time we breathe the cold air in our surroundings of about 12 degrees, by the time it hits the back of the throat, it's almost 30 degrees. Okay, so we know this from our simulations, we know this from experiments, and so our simulations tells us that if you've got a geometry that's not ideal for this, then it will give us a warning signal to say, hey, this nasal cavity, there's something wrong here. It's not giving you the right heat flux or the right heat exchange. Okay, so it gets to about 30 and then starts to plateau, and then down further in your larynx, it starts to reheat up towards 35, 36 degrees, which is ideal lung temperature. Okay, so those input markers or input data that we've identified are going to be used as our input parameters, which we're going to use to put into our AI-assisted analysis, which is our convolution neural network, and that's going to help us for our virtual surgery. Our optimized drug delivery. And then we're going to use a reduced order model to get rapid results to allow us to provide the guidance for the virtual or for the surgery strategy. We need to also establish objective measures and also some hypotheses, and then that will guide us for our appropriate diagnosis and treatment. I'm just going to skim through this part, which is the reduced order model and the steps that we're taking to get there, and also with the neural network in the next slide. So we're going to classify each person's nasal cavity, and that will establish our different reduced order models. We then establish or set up the training data, and this is the part where it's going to be most time consuming to create the correct data that we need. And these will be used as our data sampling input parameters. We can then generate the surface response curves to produce to have a look at the parameter and the input-output response. And then we can generate the best ROM for use. Okay, so when we look at what input we need for for the ROM data, this is the workflow that we want to establish. A patient comes in, they get their scan. We make an experimental model, which is a 3D printed airway model, and a computation model concurrently. We do a CFD simulation analysis. Our ENT surgeon produces or performs the surgical maneuver or the surgical treatment. We do exact same thing in the virtual space. The patient then goes back for a secondary scan, and then we compare the results of the patient pre-surgery and post-surgery in both in vivo and in vitro. So this is a lot of text, but I just wanted to demonstrate that the variety of choices the surgeon has in terms of what surgery techniques they can apply. In patients with nasal airway obstruction, the following is thought to restore nasal airflow. So we've got septal removal, and I'll show a slide later with cross-sectional planes of nasal cavity without the septum. Nasal valve, where they open that region up, and osteotomy and middle turbinate, where they remove part of the bony structure. I'll just leave these: unionectomy, antrostomy, ethmoidectomy, sphenoidotomy, polypectomy. So the surgeon has a lot of choice, and it's difficult for, I won't say unskilled, but difficult for junior surgeons to make the right decisions, or those that are confronted with unusual, atypical cases. So the doctors need, well, we've talked with the surgeons, and they do want to be able to quantify these decisions that they make. Okay, so the second part of the project is to have a look at the input data now, so that we can apply the correct medical therapy for the patients. So now we take the patient geometry markers, again, their objective and subjective test results, demographic data, and we can also look at the nasal spray device and also the nasal irrigation device, and there was also the nebulizer device as well. So this is the workflow that we've got. You start off with the medical imaging scan, the image segmentation step, which extracts the airway from the scans and converts into a 3D model. This is a really important part of the project. When I first did this in 2005, when I started my PhD, my first model took 6 months to create, from CT scan to CAD model to simulation. Now we've got automated segmentation that takes half a day, and you basically can go from CT scan to full simulation in about less than a day. So we've advanced from 6 months' work in my PhD to now where we can do this in less than a day. And so how can we get this tool of simulation that takes a lot of time to be able to say, okay, the surgeons get the scans, they can get the results straight away. And that's true point of care, and that's what we want to get to. So this first stage here is really exciting, because now we can look at lots and lots of data. We can look at thousands of different models. The input parameters, well, I'll talk about that next, and then you can get the simulation data, and that will give us our output. We did a pre-machine learning, pre-AI study in 2020. Instead, we just used a simple correlation matrix to look at different parameters that influence deposition. We applied it onto 2 types of surgical procedures, and we've got here the darker, larger circle gives you your correlation. So the full red gives you a positive correlation, and the full blue circle gives you a negative, but also strong correlation, which are the Pearson's correlations. So we can tell that, okay, these are our, you probably can't see that in the audience, but these are the regions: sphenoid sinus, nasopharynx, maxillary sinus, frontal sinus. And where we have a large circle, such as this red circle, we look down, and it tells us that, okay, if we've got a lot of sinus deposition, then that deposition is primarily caused by the ethmoid deposition. So correlation matrices are really fascinating to provide rapid analysis for multi-parameters that we want to investigate. Recently then we advanced this work using a very similar number of permutations we trained the same permutation on the spray, and it was also then able to predict the most sensitive parameters for us. So these two studies are quite related and linked together. Okay, so what are the challenges to establish our data, our training set? There are an exhaustive amount of variations in your nasal cavity. You look at your nose, you look at someone else's nose, and they're so different from size, length, height, and width. Now, these nasal cavities are ones that have undergone surgery, and I want to again demonstrate how varied surgery can be as well. If you see a white space between the left and right, that's because there's a septum, the bone. So black means airway, white regions are bone, and these kind of wings, these regions outside are called your maxillary sinuses, and they just sit under your chins right here. Okay. What happens is you experience sinus pain. You want to take drugs to get in there to relieve that pain, to relieve the congestion, or at worst case, some kind of bacterial virus in there. But you can't get the drugs in there because the sinuses are sitting laterally, connected by a very thin tubing called the ostium. So when it becomes unbearable, surgeons come in with their little drill and start drilling the bone out, which is not a very nice thought. But you can see that here, it starts to open up, okay? And in some cases, we probably, that's not in this one. This one has been drilled out quite a lot, you can see here. Okay. And so a lot of our work is to determine and evaluate whether these surgical procedures are efficient or effective. A second challenge is that drug delivery is multiphysics. So it's not a matter of just looking at particles that deposit and then that's the end of the simulation. We've got breakup, we've got mucus surface that moves, and then we've got penetration through the mucus, and then we've got chemical reaction of the drug compound diffusing through the mucus, and that diffusion rate into the mucus is a rate against the mucociliary clearance, which is your defense mechanism of removing foreign particles. Okay, so anything that gets trapped in your mucus is getting flushed away by your mucociliary clearance mechanism. And so your drugs need to penetrate quickly, otherwise it gets cleared out. Drug delivery devices are aerosols and they're very small, and we need to characterize these we have to characterize this aerosol behavior because they become input parameters. Okay, so very challenging because we're looking at micron scales and at times moving at meters, like 10 to 20 meters per second. This is an example of the nasal irrigation bottle that we were looking at, and this is also a multi-physics approach. So here we're looking at the different types of squeeze mechanisms and angles to try and enhance the saline liquid formulation to enter the different regions of the sinuses. So this is was a fun project to work on, investigating the bottle design, and the company are releasing a larger bottle. So you might see that out on the shelves soon, where they used to have a typical bottle, but soon you'll see a larger version of that bottle, and that's from this work. And let me know if you get it. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so where does this take us? We've also got the full integrated airway from the nostril region, oral cavity to the lungs. We can extend this project to include the entire airway, and also when we shift from steady state simulation into full breathing cycle. So steady state simulation is just one flow rate, can be done in about 20 minutes. When we move into full breathing cycle, over 4 seconds, when you're looking at time steps of about 0.001, that's, you're looking at almost 10, 20,000 time steps of simulation. So the workload increases and scales by a significant amount. I'd just like to thank all the collaborators and acknowledge all the people that have helped contribute to this project. Thank you very much.
Good evening to you all. My name's Stuart Knowles. I'm a lead principal engineer at Invetech. We develop a range of biomedical equipment, mostly concentrating in point of care, but we also do medium diagnostic machines and are going into cell therapy equipment, processing equipment. Hopefully I have better luck with this thing. Invetech's been in the product development business for quite a while. We've covered a number of large players around the globe. We have an office in San Diego in the US, and we also have a motion business out of Boston. Move on. So as I say, we like to get in very early and help clients bring products to market. That may be therapies, it may be point of care devices. Particularly, we also support contract manufacturing and the customer automation is more centred on the cell therapy businesses these days in terms of processing patient cells. I was going to say, by the way, as we go through this, Professor Fletcher and I have not collaborated on our presentations at all. Oh, that's a new font. All right. My personal background is I left Monash. I went into the CSIRO for a limited period of time doing heat and mass transfer, and that was straight away I was into simulations. After that, I went for a bit of a tour. I call it an unintentional joining of the wind turbine industry because I was working as a chef in a pub in Cornwall. So I don't think a careers director would necessarily send you there. That took me around the world a little bit. And in particular, it pulled me over to California where that machine was designed from a blank piece of paper in 9 months, and that was standing in Texas. So part of that accelerated design process was all through simulations, particularly from a gentleman who was the head aerodynamicist who built a model of that entire machine, not just the blades. He built the gearbox, the control system, the tower, all the way into the business model so that we could predict if you put that machine up in a particular elevation, 2,000 metres above sea level, and had a particular wind flow, what its return on your investment would be. So simulation doesn't necessarily stick with the actual product. It can go into the business world and present you with data to sell your case, basically. From that business, I went. They went bust, believe it or not, in a set of bad years in the mid-90s, and I went into MEMS, where again, heavily into simulation of devices, and I've got a case study from that. Came back to Australia in 2010 and have been at Invetech since. So that's a successful simulation result, and I always like to put up a good experimental result for you. That's a bad experimental result. That is serious. That is in Texas after 170-mile-an-hour winds went through that wind farm. So what can you simulate? We mentioned a what-if scenario. I think that's the way I like to use simulation the most. To answer a number of what-if scenarios is where its most power is. What can you simulate? I've been impressed at the continued speed of computers. It's more a case of what you can't simulate these days, and as far as I'm concerned, if you can't simulate it today, you only need to wait a couple of years. Moore's law will help you out there. And I've got some reasonable examples. So these are two relatively recent simulations that we've done. One of them is just simply a high-speed centrifuge spinning up, and it's got an out-of-balance situation, so we can cover all of those sort of more simple physical cases. Simulations also go beyond ANSYS. Sorry, guys. At the bottom, we've got a simulation of a robot, of a fairly complex piece of equipment handling materials, and we came out of this able to tell the client that they didn't need to use 4 of their processing bays, that they only needed 3 because the 4th one was never getting used. So again, it's more of a business and machine architecture value. Why do we use it? I think first and foremost, it's much faster. I think some of David's work touched on this. We can iterate the design much, much faster, virtually. The amount of cost that it takes to produce a good experiment and come out with some results is not worth it. For example, that unit up in the very top right corner there, that is a moulded component processing, and it's used for processing some cell therapies. It would take probably 6 months to change that chamber and find out a new flow regime. We can do that in a day in the virtual space. You can get to information that you really can't measure. Again, this was touched on earlier again. As you can see, particularly with the bottom one there, we've just sliced the daylights out of it to tell us what the velocity is as fluid progresses through that system. We couldn't measure that, and if I can additionally add the device up the top is a counterflow centrifuge. That's spinning at over 2,500 RPM. So how do you measure something on a spinning platform like that? Right? It's simply, you really can't do it. The best we can do is take photographs, strobe photographs, of which that top one is. Let's see if I can go over there. It can expand your understanding of actually what's going on in terms of the physics. Again, it's been covered. You really need to understand the physics of what you're working with in order to get the most out of simulation. And finally, right down the bottom, quite often we can use that to model processes and then put that process into automated equipment or processing equipment. I've got a couple of examples on that. So you don't necessarily use simulation data to improve your design. You may actually go on and use that to develop your manufacturing processes. What have I got? Yes. So these are old things. If you're going to use simulation, you do need to know your tools, right? And again, you can get lots of nice coloured pictures out of it, you can get nice videos, but if you don't actually have an understanding of what that's telling you or whether that's realistic, it can be quite damaging. You need to have good inputs, right? It's garbage in equals garbage out with simulation. When you're running these analyses, it's always good to have an endpoint. What are you trying to achieve or understand about it? And know that before you set your simulation up. Otherwise, you might have to go back and rerun all your simulations looking for other data outputs that you didn't collect the first time through. And finally, and this was touched in again, you always need to be able to back your simulation up with experimental data or known cases that you can run to confirm that your simulation is giving you the correct answers. And it's incredibly important to do that if you're breaking new ground. If you haven't done these simulations before, or maybe you are really cutting new ground, you need to be able to tie that back, and it is a loop. Simulation, some experimental backup, And once you can believe your simulation, then you can get on with it and really improve things quickly. So there's a case study here. This is very old, but the good thing about this is it's not protected by any IP, so I can discuss this at will. This is the MEMS sensor that was designed when I was in California. I call it a next generation device. That device usually took at least about 4 months to change the device. You had to go out and get new photolithography masks, you had to put it through the manufacturing line, you had to get the sensors mounted, and then you had to go off and get them tested. The aerospace device was at Rev Y, so that's how many revisions that they went through in order to get the device at the final point. The automotive device at the time they went to production was at K. We basically started a new type of simulation, full piezoelectric, gave us a lot more information. We got it into production at Rev D, and that included a one mask set that had 2 revisions in the one thing, and the whole purpose of the AB was merely to prove that the simulation was correct. A and B had some key performance parameters that were meant to be separated. One of them, for example, was the sensitivity was meant to be 20% better in A than B, and it came out to be 18% better. So we had a lot of faith in the simulation at that point, and we were able to put far more effort in and deliver Rev C, which needed a very small tweak to become Rev D. Getting back to that emphasis of you can't measure data, these, you can't touch them when they're running. They run like little musical tuning forks. So these ones were operating at about 11 kilohertz. If you touched it, it stopped vibrating. The amount of electrical charge going on and off was so minute that if you touched it, you would affect the electrical charge. You couldn't measure that either. The sensitivity at the tip of the tines at one end is less than a picometer. So atoms are 30 to 100 picometer. I checked that up. So this basically had a sensitivity at the end of the thing that was less than an atom, the diameter of an atom. It's quite extraordinary. We built the first set of forks we built. They went through the manufacturing process, and they didn't behave like people thought they should behave. These things, they need to be balanced. They're a bit like an out-of-wheel problem, an out-of-balance wheel problem in your car when you first make it. They do get balanced in. And when they went to try and balance them, they did some strange things. We went back to the simulation, had a look at it, found some extra physics that we weren't necessarily aware of, and then that actually fed into the next design and improved the fork again. So quite considerable. What else have we got? I've got a point over there, don't I? And finally, the simulation that we did, we basically were able to build a model of these forks and put it into the manufacturing equipment. So as the manufacturing equipment was dealing with each particular fork, it had a much better opportunity to yield that fork and significantly reduce the amount of time that it took to tune that thing in. So Invetech, I was sort of limited on what I could discuss in terms of what we do, but we'll go through a few of the things. Computational fluid dynamics is a big subject for us these days. We use it for simple things like heat transfer out of cooling fins to far more complicated things like the counterflow centrifuge that I just had up there. It's certainly an expansion, I think, in the last 10 years in my professional career that's becoming more dominating. I didn't actually mention something. I will later. Piezoelectric, thermoelectric devices, that's pretty bog standard. Peltier devices in particular, which are used to heat and cool. We model those a lot. I'll comment on that later. Lots of standard analyses. Mostly intended on getting the product to market faster, making sure parts come off and they work properly the first time. And finally, plastics injection moulding. We always do this on plastic parts these days if you're going to injection mould them, because the cost of having to fix the mould is fairly high, and it blows schedule out. We also cover a few more custom simulation areas. That includes the robot scheduler that I've already put up. We use that to optimise our machine architecture before we actually start designing in earnest. We've modelled those Peltiers to the point where we've now got a custom thermal control module, which is extremely quick. Luckily, I don't have to say what PCR is anymore, I've found. Everybody's fully aware of what that is. And finally, on more unusual things, we'll go and do some custom simulations. So one of the ones that we've recently looked at is a biosensor, and what happens when you get extremely low levels of molecule that you're trying to chase. You end up with stochastic problems. And so we've started to develop understandings of those things. All of this is again to accelerate that process to the end. Went through that pretty quick. I was short and sweet. I do want to mention why I emphasise simulation a lot at Invetech and try and get people involved in it. That first fork that I was talking about, I ran a very reduced model. I know it used to run in 2 hours and 38 minutes on the first computer that I was running in, dare I say, 1997. I gave it a bit of a burst yesterday on our box, which is 3 years old now, and it's solved in 13 seconds. So this is why simulation's going to continue to expand, is because the computing power and what you can leverage from that computing power is continuing to grow. That's all. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So just a bit about me first. So my name is Vishesh. I am a senior mechanical engineer right now in Leica Biosystems, but before that I graduated from University of Rajasthan back in India, then joined automotives, like work in automotive sectors like for a couple of years. Then moved to Stryker India, which is basically my first medical device industry. And there I was involved in hip and knee implants designing, as I think Dr. David already mentioned earlier. Basically, I was involved in simulation from the beginning of my career in some way. Automotive was a bit boring. All we did was structural analysis and vibration, which is model analysis and ANSYS. But coming to medical devices, it will give you a lot more opportunity to do different simulation, because your system generally consists of various interactions such as fluidics, thermal, mechanical structures, all of those components. Okay, so a bit about Leica Biosystems as well. So it's part of a bigger global Danaher group. Leica Biosystems is pioneer in the field of cancer diagnostic equipments, and it's spread across various locations around the world. So we own end-to-end diagnostic, basically cancer diagnostic. In Melbourne, we design and manufacture some of the flagship products such as Polaris Bond family. Like there are a couple of bonds starting from Bond Max, which is the basic version, to more advanced Bond Prime, which we have recently launched. So my role in Leica, basically I'm a part of product development group. I work for both new product development and sustaining the existing product, kind of like whenever you got an obsolescence issue or a quality issue from market, or continuous cost improvement, which is WAVE in industry terms. All the projects we work on have a combination, as I said earlier, various disciplines such as mechanical, fluidics, thermal, electronics, all of them are combining together, sort of. And a project team typically can range from a single person to a team of 10 to 15 engineers, depending upon the size and scope of the problem or project. In a typical new product development cycle, I think the simulation basically comes when you do this design, build, and test cycle. So instead of doing this design, build, and test iterative approach, you can basically use simulation to optimize your design. And again, you have to create a validated or verified model to make sure that whatever you are doing is actually true. So that is where I insert the simulation. There is another element where what we do is like problem solving approach. Like if you have a quality issue in one of your instrument or in any subsystem in general, then basically to understand the problem, we use simulation a lot. To understand and also generate various solutions, we use simulation a lot as well. So further, so my work is not as deep and complex as some of the other presenters here. I'm quite young in the career still. So basically, two of the case studies I'm gonna present here is thermal analysis of slide heaters and design optimization of poly. I had some nice example from some of my previous experience, but can't share here because of they are IP protected and I don't have the data anymore anyways. So basically what we were trying to do, so in our instrument we have slide heaters. So basically what you do, you take tissue from a patient, you put that tissue on a slide. That slide is heated by a slide heater and you apply various chemicals and get sort of staining. That staining further will be diagnosed by an expert to tell whether it's a cancer or not. So what I was trying to do is like basically to benchmark the temperature profile on a slide heater. And why we are doing it is basically we wanted to ensure that temperature profile and cooling rate was under the threshold or whatever our requirements set for that instrument. So basically, so this is again the theoretical, one picture is like thermal analysis, what we did in ANSYS, and then we validated it again. I think we have talked enough about validation using thermal imaging camera. There are some data of probes which is not shown here. So basically we measure the temperature on different nodes in the ANSYS and again correlate it with the thermal camera by measuring various points that our model is verified. And then the advantage of doing that is like whenever we change the design, we don't need to go and do that again, that testing, that expensive testing. What we can do, we can evaluate different candidates and alternatives and do the simulation once we have this template verified. The other thing what we did is basically we wanted to understand like when we are ramping up a slide heater, there will be heat losses. So there will be heat losses through conduction, convection, radiation, all sort of things. We wanted to understand using a standalone slide heater that once the temperature get to a stabilizing point, which is 102 degrees centigrade, how much power we need to feed to the heater and how much these losses are going to go to in that conduction, all those different sort of things. So again, this is an example of FE versus practical. In the bottom scale is the time, top scale is the temperature, and as you can see, it's like pretty close. This is again not so critical or complex example, but it's still something I wanted to share. That is very basic, and that will also give you an idea like how in industry generally we don't use simulation in that deep or complex way. Sometimes like it can be used for these simple things as well. We had a problem with a supplier where current design of a pulley got obsolete, so we had to test and try different. So we have to design different concepts of the pulleys, and then before going into the testing, we did a lot of simulation to understand that the deflection what we are getting on the pulley and the tightening torque is the same as per the old design, because these pulleys like they don't have that much thickness. So if you tighten them too much, they will break. So we did this simulation and finally optimized the design, find a good solution, and then implemented that in production. Again, I will say I am also a big fan of simulation. It's like if you want to cut down your product development cycle and also like you want to get like efficient results, I think simulation should be used more and more. The problem what I see is like again the garbage in garbage out thing, which is very true, is basically someone who doesn't have enough understanding of simulation. They have to first understand the physical system quite thoroughly. Like if, for example, if you are investigating something, if you don't understand your boundary condition quite well, whatever you feed to the model, it's not going to give you a valid result. And if you are going to set up a model to compare different options or designs, it's better to validate it. It's always better to validate it because you don't know whatever you're feeding is giving you a practical, measurable or comparable result as per the practical scenario. In my organization, I'm basically setting up a bi-weekly technical learning sessions where I'm holding these sessions with a couple of young engineers where we go through these case studies. We take different session every week. One week we do like a static structural analysis, then we go for model of vibration analysis, then we do thermal analysis. And also, I'm the part of the group who is pushing management to get the CFD license. That is like probably a bit hard because we don't have that strong business case as of now, but hopefully in future. And hopefully I see simulation getting used more and more in industry. So that's all about me. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We've obviously run a bit over time, so unfortunately we're going to have to not have our Q&A session this evening because I'm sure you've got other things to do, and as I say, we're a bit over time. So I just wanted to close in thanking the sponsors of the Convergent Science Network who make these events possible. Their contribution allows us to have the kind of presentation we had this evening. And thanks to David and his colleagues, we have a very good idea. I'm sure you all have a very good understanding of the importance of digital twins. And I think for our local medical technology and medical devices industry, it is a very exciting time, and the advances in simulation are going to hopefully make our companies more competitive. The role of universities in training people to be part of this exciting development. So thank you to the presenters this evening for sharing these advances. So will you please join with me in thanking them. Thank you very much. I'm going to contact you tomorrow with an email and ask you to give us 2 minutes of your time to complete an anonymous survey. It's really important for us to hear what you thought about the event, how we can do things better. We're here to serve you, so please feel free to tell us the bad and the good that you've found from this event this evening. I want to thank Leap Australia for their support in making this event possible. They suggested the idea to me some time ago, and they worked very hard to recruit the speakers this evening. So again, a big thank you to the people at Leap Australia for making this event possible. And to thank the technical team that in the background who made sure the event ran smoothly. Eden, Colin and Vlad, thank you very much. And to RMIT University for allowing us to use this amazing facility. This event has been recorded and will be available on the Convergent Science Network website tomorrow. Thank you for joining us this evening, those of you here in person and those online, and good evening. We'll see you in a future event. Thank you very much.